We don't need God to be good, but I would say we needed God for the very concept of good. Let me try and explain what I mean by that. And it's very important that we don't misunderstand this. The new atheists are saying, look, an atheist can behave as well as a religious believer, sometimes better. And it's quite clear that we've got fundamentally a common kind of morality. I mean, if you take all the people in this room and place before them the kind of switch tracks moral dilemma that we love doing in ethics among medical students or any students. So you are standing at the points and a train is thundering down the track and you can place it on one of two tracks. And as you look down those two tracks, on one of them, there's one person standing on the track. On the other track, there's a busload of people. If the train goes down the first track, one person will be killed. If it goes down the other track, 50 people will be killed. Virtually 100% of people, whatever background they come from, will say, well, if you have to do one or the other, it's the one rather than the 100. They act on a utilitarian basis. Therefore, says Richard Dawkins, in his book, this is the example he quotes actually, it's quite clear we don't need God to be good. So what would I want to say to that? I would want to say that it is absolutely right, and I would expect it to be so, that although there are differences between ethnic groups about, for example, how many wives you can have and so on, in general, there's a fundamental core of morality that you find all around the world. C.S. Lewis describes it in Mere Christianity and in his book, The Abolition of Man. Now, Dawkins claims that proves there's no God. I claim it's evidence that there is a God. Because according to the Bible, we are made in the image of God as moral beings. And therefore, I would expect to find that intrinsic moral sense in everybody, whether they believed in God or not. So therefore, my first answer to the question would be, of course, atheists can behave very well. And I would be the last person to want to give the impression that they don't. In fact, sometimes professing Christians are put to shame by the behavior of their atheist and agnostic friends. That, for me, is simply evidence that the Bible is correct. But now let me take the next step. You see, Richard Dawkins, for example, says in his book, we don't need God to be good. But I want to now talk to Richard Dawkins himself. And I'm sorry he's not here with us, you know. He could have been a great...
He did send his apology.
Oh, did he? Right. Well, thank you very much. It would be great because it's so interesting to hear these things directly. Where do you get your concept of good? Indeed, there's a lot of criticism in his book of biblical morality and so on. The reason I say that is he is explicit in one of his writings about what the universe is like. And he said, the universe is exactly what we would expect. And I'm roughly quoting here. If at bottom it's pitiless, there's no good, there's no evil, there is no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, I find that utterly fascinating, because that seems to me to be undermining all morality. There is no base there for even saying what is good and what is evil. So I want to say to Richard Dawkins, your brand of atheism, logically speaking, and you confess it yourself, gives us no basis for morality. You can be moral yourself, and I wouldn't criticize that because you're a human being made in the image of God. But what we're talking about here is something deeper, and it was something that the great Russian novelist Dostoevsky saw very clearly, and Nietzsche took it up as well. If God does not exist, then everything is permissible. In other words, he was saying, if you remove God from the equation, then everything is permissible. You've no base for your morality. And I think actually we're seeing that among some of the atheist writers that aren't represented here, like Peter Singer and John Gray. We're seeing them take that to its logical conclusion, and we're seeing human beings being seriously publicly devalued.
Well, let's mention Singer, because you just gave his name. It seems the logical conclusion of the Dawkins position is perhaps espoused and represented by Singer. Singer, as I understand it, sees no difference between the life or the value of a life of a pig and an infant child.
That's correct.
Now, how does he come to that conclusion?
Well, he comes to that conclusion. Let me quote someone else. Professor John Gray, who's a very influential intellectual in London at the moment. He's a professor of the history of European thought at LSE. I heard him lecturing in Oxford recently. And he makes the point. He says to people who are the ultra-Darwinists, he says, look, give up looking among your Darwinian theories for any sense of progress on which you can base your ethics. Give it up, forget it. Because the trouble with you is this: you haven't accepted the logical force of what Darwin has proved. Because what he's proved, according to them, is that the whole thing is mindless and undirected, so that, and now the conclusion, human life, and I quote now, is of no more significance than slime mold, a particularly lowly form of bacteria, you see. And so he has challenged them and laughing them. He said the trouble is philosophy has not yet given up the values of the Christian faith, although it's given up the Christian faith. And we need to come of age and need to realize that where we are intellectually is a world in which we really have to construct our own morality. Now that's a very dangerous kind of situation, and I see that beginning to happen, because if there is no God who's been the traditional guarantor of morality, as you've said, if you remove God, the number of possible logical bases for morality, it seems to be a relatively few. If there's no God out there and all you've got is the material universe in here, that's where you've got to get your morality. Either in raw matter, genetics and its complications, a la Crick and the rest of them, or in society and its evolution, or in some sort of mixture of the two. And that's proving extremely difficult. So I want to say to Richard Dawkins, you are actually undermining morality, and the danger is if you teach that in society, we're going to find that our young people begin to believe you.
But his answer, it seems to me, is to say, well, that might be right. That might be the consequence. But the question is whether there is a God or not. It doesn't affect whether there's a God or not. It might be that if there is no God, this is a grotesque, cruel universe.
Yes, that's right.
And that's the way it is. We've just got to face up to that and make the best of it.
Well, that's exactly right, and I make that point in the debate. I think he's right there. If he is right, then we have to face up to that's how it is, like it or lump it. But I want to ask the question, is he right? What's his evidence? And if he, on the one hand, is undermining rationality, and on the other hand is undermining morality, I'm going to be a little bit quizzical, because I want to come round on the other side and say there is real evidence for the existence of God on the positive side, both from science and history and human experience. So I think I would want to start now putting in some positive things rather than just being on the defensive and deconstructing his arguments.
So the new atheism seems to come to this point, that they recognize that absent an external lawgiver, it's down to ourselves to make the best of it, to make up whatever rules and morals that we choose. And in fact, most of the people throughout history have come on a certain common set of rules.
Yes, I think that's fair.
And that's the Darwinian explanation for that is, well, that was driven by preservation. That's what we evolve with. Mm-hmm. And that's all there is. So let's just make the best of it and get on.
And some scientists are making, mainly scientists, interesting, are making a concerted intellectual effort to do so. And coming up with fascinating ideas. I mean, the entomologist E.O. Wilson and Michael Ruse have come up with the idea that morality is an illusion fobbed off on us by our selfish genes to get us to cooperate. So morality is immoral in its conception. And those sort of curious things seem to me that what you're getting is a beautifully scientifically dressed up logical incoherence.
Now, talking of incoherence, the next theme that they seem to develop is not only that religion or God is redundant, but the idea of God is a positively harmful thing, that it's something which should be banished now that we have recognized we don't need him to explain the world, we don't need him to tell us how to live. we actually find that he's been a harmful influence when he's been around. So they want to remove him.
Yes.
Now, surely on this, they're a much stronger ground, because when they look through history, there are lots of examples of religion causing divisions, that this part of the world is no stranger to that. Throughout history, you have the Crusades, you have the terrible events in September '01 in America, and so on and so on. And religion is something which historically, they will say, and perhaps with substance, has caused a huge deal of suffering.
I think we need to take this extremely seriously, because the very fact that this book here has sold 1.5 million copies, probably 2 million copies by now in English, shows that it's hitting a nerve. And it interested me to see an interview in Der Spiegel, which is a leading German magazine. And the cover title was, "God is to blame for everything." And there was a picture of the Twin Towers. And an interview with the four people and a number of others as well. But in it, Dawkins said, and I found it interesting, he said that the thing that got him going on this, and I quote, "9/11 radicalized me." This is where we get with religion. And I say, stop. Religion is, to quote now Christopher Hitchens, it poisons everything. And okay, you can say that's extremist religion, but extremist religion thrives on the edge of moderate religion. So the only solution is, since religion is poisonous and dangerous and violent, get rid of religion. And at the beginning of the book, as you probably know, he quotes the famous song by John Lennon, Imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine a world without the Taliban and so on. And when Richard quotes it, he says, imagine a world without Northern Ireland, which I thought was a fairly serious thing to say. If we didn't exist, ladies and gentlemen, I think that would pose curious philosophical problems this evening. But we know what he means. And having grown up in this country, I know exactly what he means. That there is an unacceptable face of religion which is terrifying people today. And we've got to face it. And I want to take very seriously, and I told him in the debate openly and publicly, that I sympathize with a great deal of what he and the others say on this topic. Now, you mentioned specific things, like the Crusades. And they were done in the name of Christ, where Muslims and Jews were slaughtered and so on. What do I say about that? I'm ashamed of it as a Christian. Let me say it absolutely straight. I am ashamed that the name of Christ has been associated with that kind of thing. Now, what I then observe, having confessed my shame, in a number of things. Firstly, that the people that take guns or weapons of violence in the name of Christ are not obeying Christ. They're disobeying him. Because the fascinating thing, and I think it's going to be very important in this debate as it rolls on, I've often wondered why the New Testament spends so much time on the trial of Christ. And I'm coming to the conclusion that one of the reasons is that Christ was charged with fomenting terrorism. In other words, he was charged with the very same thing that the new atheists are throwing at me. And Christ was publicly exonerated by the Roman political authority, Pilate, from that. Of course, Pilate was a coward and he bowed to pressure, and we know all about that. But the interesting thing was that he could find no fault in Christ, because he would have had the report of the centurion that went with the soldiers to arrest Christ and discovered that when Peter raised his sword, and wasn't very good in his aim because he had very little practice, I suppose, he tried to cut the chap's head off and he cut his ear off. And what Christ did was to put the ear back on. Physically and literally, I believe, although that raises all kinds of other questions for the new atheists about miracles, but Christ put the ear back on. And it seems to me that's not only a literal happening, it's a wonderful parable. That wherever people have taken the sword for the name of Christ, they've cut the ears off people. In fact, they've cut the ears off the new atheists. The new atheists don't want to listen to anything I say about Christianity because of this. But what did Christ say? He said, put your sword back. Those that take the sword will perish by the sword. But most importantly, he publicly said at his trial before